need to tell you about what happened to me last summer. I've kept it to myself for months now, but I can't anymore. The weight of carrying this story alone is becoming too much to bear. It all started when I inherited my grandfather's cabin, a place I'd loved as a child but hadn't visited in nearly 15 years. The cabin sat on 20 acres of densely wooded land in northern Michigan, about 30 miles from the nearest town. My grandfather had been a solitary man after my grandmother died, preferring the company of trees and wildlife to people. When he passed away quietly in his sleep at 87, I was surprised to learn he'd left the property to me. I'd been struggling in Chicago, a dead-end marketing job, a recently ended 5-year relationship, and mounting debt had left me feeling trapped. The inheritance seemed like perfect timing, a chance to escape, to heal, to start over. I arranged to work remotely, packed what little I wanted to keep into my Honda Civic, and headed north. The drive took longer than expected. Rain pounded my windshield as I navigated increasingly narrow and poorly maintained roads. Cell service disappeared about 10 miles before my turnoff. It was nearly dusk when I finally pulled up to the cabin. Standing there in the fading light, the structure looked smaller than I remembered. A simple A-frame with a wide porch wrapped around 3 sides. The forest had encroached over the years, with branches now brushing against the roof and sides. Fallen leaves carpeted the clearing, and the air smelled of pine and dampness. I remember thinking how peaceful it was. No traffic noise, no neighbors, just the whisper of wind through trees and distant birdsong. That first night, I fell asleep to the gentle patter of rain on the roof, feeling more relaxed than I had in years. I woke to brilliant sunshine streaming through the dusty windows. The cabin needed work. There was no denying that. The plumbing groaned, the electricity was spotty, and years of minimal maintenance had left it somewhat dilapidated. But it was mine, and it was exactly what I needed. For the first week, I settled into a comfortable routine. Mornings were for work, afternoons for repairs and exploration, evenings for reading by the fireplace. I began clearing out my grandfather's belongings, mostly practical items, tools, clothing, and books. Lots of books. It was while organizing these books that I found his journals. 12 leather-bound volumes, each meticulously dated and filled with his neat, precise handwriting. My grandfather had kept detailed records of his life at the cabin. Wildlife sightings, weather patterns, maintenance tasks, and occasional reflections. I started reading them chronologically, curious about his solitary life. The early entries were what you might expect: observations about birds nesting near the cabin, notes about repairing the roof, comments on particularly beautiful sunsets. But around the 8th journal, covering the period about 5 years before his death, the tone began at night, sounds he couldn't identify, movements in the forest that didn't match known wildlife patterns. He began tracking what he called incursions, moments when he felt something was watching the cabin. April 17th, 2018, incursion at 2:13 a.m., east side, duration 7 minutes, no visual confirmation. May 2nd, 2018, incursion at 3:40 a.m., north corner, duration 12 minutes, glimpsed shadow movement through window, too large for deer, wrong shape for bear. The entries continued like this, becoming increasingly frequent. My grandfather had been a rational man, a former engineer with Boeing before retirement, not given to flights of fancy or superstition. His methodical documentation of these events unsettled me. In the final journal, dated the year before his death, the entries became even more disturbing. September 8th, 2019. It's getting closer. Found unusual marks on trees at perimeter. Not consistent with known animal behavior. Set up trail cameras. September 15th, 2019. Cameras show nothing but static when triggered at night. Batteries drain completely despite being new. October 3rd, 2019. It stood at the edge of the clearing last night. I saw it from the bedroom window. Tall, still, watching. The last entry was dated just 3 weeks before he died. December 12th, 2019. I know what it wants now. I've made chill running through me despite the warmth of the cabin. That night, I found myself listening more intently to the sounds of the forest. What had my grandfather been experiencing? Had dementia taken hold in his final years? Or was there something else? When I returned to the cabin, I searched through my grandfather's journals again, looking for any mention or description of these marks. There was nothing specific, only his brief note about unusual marks on trees. That evening, as darkness fell, I found myself more aware of the isolation of the cabin. The forest that had seemed so peaceful now felt watchful. The darkness between the trees deeper than seemed natural. I made sure all the windows were secured and the doors locked before settling in for the night. Deeper than seemed natural. I made sure all the windows were secured and the doors locked before settling in for the night. My grandfather's journals spread across the kitchen table. I decided to look for the trail cameras he had mentioned. After searching the shed and storage areas, I found them in a box in the attic. 4 game cameras, the kind hunters use to track animal movements. They were expensive models, still in good condition. Curious about what they might have captured, I checked the memory cards. 3 of the cards were completely corrupted, unreadable by my laptop, but the 4th contained a single video file, dated October 4th, 2019, the day after my grandfather wrote about seeing something at the edge of the clearing. The video showed a nighttime view of the forest edge. For the first minute, nothing moved except branches swinging, pixelation spreading from the center outward. Just before the video cut to static, there was a frame that showed something. I played it back, pausing at that moment. The image quality was poor, but I could make out what appeared to be a figure standing between 2 trees. It was tall, at least 7 feet, and unnaturally thin. The proportions weren't right for a human. Though mostly in shadow, the outline suggested long limbs and an elongated torso. I couldn't make out any facial features. Just a darker smudge where a head should be. I told myself it was probably just a trick of light and shadow, perhaps a bear standing upright, distorted by the camera's poor night vision capabilities. Yet a sense of unease settled over me, the same feeling you get when you suddenly realize your night vision capabilities. Yet a sense of unease settled over me, the same feeling you get when you suddenly realize you're being watched. That night, I dreamed of the forest. In my dream, I was walking among the trees, but they were different. Taller, darker, more densely packed. I was searching for something, though I didn't know what. The deeper I went, the more the forest changed, until I was no longer walking on earth, but on a surface that felt almost fleshy beneath my feet. The trees were no longer trees, but towering columns of twisted, knotted forms that pulsed with a life of their own. In the center of this impossible forest, it from a distance, and didn't quite understand its purpose. and at every window of this wrong cabin, faces pressed against the glass. Faces that resembled my grandfather's, but distorted. Eyes too large, mouths stretched into impossible smiles. I woke gasping, drenched in sweat. Despite the cool night air, the digital clock on my nightstand read 3:17 a.m. The cabin was silent, except for the usual settling noises of an old structure. But something felt different. The air seemed heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. I lay still, listening. There, a sound outside, like something heavy moving carefully through the forest. Not the familiar scampering of nocturnal animals, or the rustle of wind. This was deliberate movement. I eased out of bed and moved to the window, staying to the side to peer out without being easily visible from outside. The nearly full moon cast enough light to see the edge of the forest clearly. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Then, between two large pines about 50 yards from the cabin, something moved. It was difficult to distinguish its shape. It seemed to blend with the shadows in a way that confused the eye. But it was tall, much taller than a person, and it moved with a fluid grace that no human or known animal could manage. It seemed to flow between the trees rather than walk. For several minutes, it remained at the forest edge, sometimes visible, sometimes fading into the darkness, so completely I questioned whether I'd seen anything at all. Then, with a movement almost too quick to follow, it retreated deeper into the woods and was gone. I stayed at the window for over an hour, watching, but saw nothing more. When I finally returned to bed, sleep eluded me. The encounter, if that's what it was, had left me with more questions than answers. The next day, I drove into town for supplies and, more importantly, information. The local library was small, but had a section dedicated to regional history. I spent hours poring over books about the area's past, looking for anything that might explain what was happening around my grandfather's property. One slim volume caught my attention: Folklore and Legends of Northern Michigan by a local historian, Eleanor Karstad. A chapter titled The Watchers of the Woods described legends from both Native American tribes and early European settlers about entities that inhabited the deepest parts of the forest. According to these stories, certain areas of the northern woods contained thin places, with a boundary between our world and another was less defined. These places were marked by unusual phenomena, strange lights, unexplained sounds, and the persistent feeling of being observed. The entities that could cross through these thin places were called by various names, but their description was consistent: tall, slender beings that could move between shadow and solid form. Most unsettling was the account of how these entities would choose certain human dwellings to observe, gradually forming connections with the inhabitants. The book described a pattern: first observation from a distance, then marking of territory, then attempts at communication, and finally, the text became vague here, using phrases like communion and exchange without clarifying what these terms meant. I checked the publication date, 1972, and noted the author's name. The librarian told me that Eleanor Karstad had passed away in the late 1980s, but her daughter still lived in town and sometimes gave talks about local history. I found Margaret Karstad's address in the phone book and decided to pay her a visit. She lived in a small, well-kept house on the outskirts of town. When I knocked, a woman in her 70s answered, her sharp eyes assessing me curiously. After I explained my situation, carefully omitting the more unsettling aspects of my experiences, she invited me in for tea. Her living room was filled with books and artifacts that spoke of a lifetime spent studying regional history and folklore. My mother was considered somewhat eccentric for taking these stories seriously. Margaret explained, pouring tea into delicate cups. The academic community dismissed her work as mere collection of superstition, but she was meticulous in her research, interviewing hundreds of people who had experiences in those woods. I asked her about the Watchers and the concept of thin places. The tribes that lived here before European settlement had strict taboos about certain areas of the forest, she said, for specific ceremonial purposes. When settlers arrived, they initially ignored these warnings, but many of those who built homes in these prohibited areas reported strange occurrences. She sipped her tea thoughtfully before continuing. My mother documented dozens of cases of what she called observed dwellings, homes where the inhabitants gradually became aware of being watched by something in the forest. The patterns were remarkably consistent across accounts separated by decades and considerable distances. I described the location of my grandfather's cabin, and Margaret's expression grew serious. That area has a history, she said quietly. In the 1930s, a logging camp was established there. The operational record cites economic factors during the Depression, but my mother interviewed one of the few surviving loggers in the 1960s. His story was quite different. According to this account, the loggers had begun experiencing unusual phenomena almost immediately after establishing the camp. Tools would disappear and reappear in different locations. Strange sounds echoed through the forest at night. Several men reported seeing unusually tall, thin figures moving among the trees at dusk. The situation escalated when they began cutting in a particular section of the forest, the same area where my grandfather's cabin now stood. 3 men vanished while working that section, their disappearances separated by just weeks. Equipment malfunctioned inexplicably. The remaining workers reported increasing feelings of being watched, followed by vivid, disturbing dreams. The breaking point came when the camp foreman was found one morning outside his cabin. He was alive but catatonic, his eyes open but unseeing, his body frozen in a posture of reaching toward something. He never spoke again and died in a psychiatric hospital 2 years later. The logging operation was abandoned within days. The land remained untouched until the 1960s, when parcels were sold. My grandfather must have purchased his plot around that time. Has anything happened that concerns you? Margaret asked, watching me closely. I hesitated, then told her about the marked trees, the corrupted camera footage, and what I had seen, or thought I had seen, at the edge of the forest. I also shared the contents of my grandfather's later journals. She nodded slowly. Your grandfather's documentation matches the pattern my mother identified. The marking of trees in a circle is particularly significant. It appears in multiple accounts. It seems to represent some form of boundary establishment or territorial claim. What does it want? I asked, the question that had been haunting me since reading my grandfather's final entry. Margaret set down her teacup. My mother believed these entities are drawn to human consciousness, that they study us out of a form of curiosity, but in some cases, the relationship evolves into something more complex. She paused. Your grandfather's final note, that he knew what it wanted and had made peace with it, suggests he reached some understanding with whatever was watching him. She rose and went to a bookshelf, returning with a worn leather journal. This was my mother's field notebook from her investigation of a similar case in 1968. The similarities to your situation are striking. You should read it, but I must ask you to return it. It's one of the few original documents I have of her research. I thanked her and promised to bring it back soon. As I was leaving, she caught my arm gently. Be careful, she said, her eyes serious. My malevolent in a human sense. They operate according to different rules, different needs, but their interest can become consuming. If the pattern holds true, it will attempt communication soon. How you respond may determine what happens next. The drive back to the cabin felt longer than before, the darkening forest pressing closer to the road. Eleanor Carstad's journal sat on the passenger seat beside me, and I was both eager and reluctant to read its contents. That night, after securing the cabin, I settled by the fireplace with the journal. Eleanor's handwriting was similar to her daughter's speech, precise, thoughtful, and dispassionately academic, even when describing disturbing events. The case she documented involved a painter named Howard Brennan, who had built a studio cabin in a remote area about 40 miles from my grandfather's property. Brennan had moved there seeking 40 miles from my grandfather's property. Brennan had moved there seeking isolation for his work, but over time began experiencing phenomena similar to what my grandfather described. A sense of being watched, unusual sounds at night, and strange marks appearing on trees surrounding his property. According to Eleanor's notes, Brennan's experience progressed to the next stage when he began having dreams of walking in an altered version of the forest around his cabin. He described the dreams as more real than reality and began painting what he saw in them. Landscapes that resembled the local forest, but with subtle, unsettling differences. Trees that twisted in anatomically impossible ways. Shadows that appeared to have dimension and substance. Colors that shouldn't exist in nature. The paintings changed over time, becoming increasingly abstract, yet somehow more precise, as if Brennan was attempting to depict something his conscious mind couldn't fully process. Eleanor included photographs of some of these works, disturbing images that seemed to shift and change the longer I looked at them. Most significant was Brennan's description of eventually seeing his watcher clearly, not just glimpses at the forest's edge, but a full manifestation that approached his cabin one night. His description matched what I had seen. Impossibly tall and thin, moving with fluid grace, its form seeming to waver between solid and shadow. According to Brennan, after this encounter, the entity began leaving gifts at the edge of his clearing, arrangements of stones, branches, and forest materials formed into complex patterns that Eleanor noted resembled mathematical fractals. The final section of Eleanor's journal documented her growing concern about Brennan's mental state. His speech had become increasingly disjointed, filled with references to the other side and the pattern beneath. He spoke of having reached an understanding with his watcher, describing it as neither communion nor possession, but a third thing for which we have no word. Eleanor's last entry noted that Brennan had stopped painting conventional images altogether and was covering the walls of his cabin with intricate symbols he claimed would open the way permanently. Howard Brennan's cabin had burned to the ground on April 17, 1968. His body was never recovered, though authorities assumed he had perished in the fire, which had reached unusually high temperatures. reducing most of the structure to ash. I closed the journal, disturbed by the parallels to my grandfather's experience. Had he followed a similar path? His final journal entry, "I know what it wants now. I've made my peace with it," echoed Brennan's claims of understanding. That night, I dreamed of the forest again. I was walking along a path I didn't recognize, though I somehow knew it was on my property. The trees around me seemed to pulse with a subtle light that emanated from within their trunks. The ground beneath my feet felt responsive, as if reacting to my weight. It seemed to pulse with a subtle light that emanated from within their trunks. The ground beneath my feet felt responsive, as if reacting to my weight. At a clearing ahead, I saw my grandfather standing with his back to me. Relief flooded through me at the sight of him, and I called out, but no sound emerged from my mouth. I tried to run toward him, but the distance between us remained constant, no matter how much I struggled forward. When he finally turned, I recoiled in shock. His face was his own, but changed. His eyes too large and entirely black. His mouth stretched in a smile that extended too far across his face. When he spoke, his voice seemed to come from everywhere around me rather than from his mouth. "You're beginning to see," he said. "That's good," I asked, the question emerging clearly despite my previous inability to speak. My grandfather's distorted face grew serious. "To know us, to be known, to share what it is and take part of what we are, an exchange. Did you let it?" I asked. His impossible smile returned. "I did. And now I am here and there, myself and other. It's not an ending, but a transformation." He gestured around us, and I realized the forest had changed while we spoke. The trees now had faces embedded in their bark, hundreds of faces, some human, some decidedly not. They watched us with eyes that blinked and mouths that silently opened and closed. "This is what waits," my grandfather said. "Neither life nor death waits," my grandfather said. "Neither life nor death, but something else, something more." I woke violently, sitting upright in bed, my heart pounding. The room was dark, but moonlight filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. Something felt different, a subtle change in the atmosphere of the cabin. That's when I noticed the arrangement on the floor beside my bed. A complex spiral pattern formed from small stones, twigs, pine needles, and what appeared to be flower petals, though no flowers were in bloom at this time of year. It was about 2 feet in diameter, meticulously constructed, each element placed with precision. I hadn't put it there. I was certain it hadn't been there when I went to sleep. With shaking hands, I turned on the bedside, even more intricate than it had appeared in the dim light. The spiral containing smaller spirals, and those containing even smaller patterns. A fractal design of remarkable complexity. I checked the doors and windows, all still locked from the inside. Nothing appeared disturbed. Yet somehow, something had entered my cabin and left this arrangement while I slept. The next morning, I photographed the spiral pattern before carefully collecting its components in a box. I wasn't sure why I felt compelled to preserve it, rather than simply sweep it away, but something about its precision and complexity made it seem important. A message I needed to understand. I spent the day researching fractal patterns and their occurrences in nature, finding unsettling parallels between mathematical chaos theory and the structure of the spiral. As evening approached, I felt increasingly uneasy. The sense of being watched had intensified, and I found myself avoiding looking directly out of the windows. Just before sunset, I heard a sound from the porch, a rhythmic tapping, like someone gently rapping on the wooden railing with a stick. When I cautiously looked outside, I saw nothing, but at the edge of the forest, between two of the marked trees, I glimpsed movement, the now familiar tall, slender shape, partially obscured by shadow. That night, I left an arrangement of my own, a simple circle of smooth stones I'd collected from a streambed nearby, placed on the porch. I wasn't entirely sure what compelled me to do this, but it felt like an acknowledgement, a response to what had been left for me. In the morning, my stone circle had been rearranged into a more complex pattern, with pine needles and small flowers woven between the stones. The pattern seemed to depict a rudimentary map, with one area clearly marked by a larger stone. Comparing it to actual maps of my property, I realized it indicated a location about half a mile into the forest, in the direction opposite from where I had found the marked trees. I decided to investigate. In daylight, the forest seemed less threatening, sunlight filtering through the canopy to create dappled patterns on the ground. I followed the crude map, using a compass to maintain my direction. The location indicated turned out to be a small clearing I hadn't discovered in my previous explorations. Unlike the natural clearings formed by fallen trees or changes in soil composition, this one seemed deliberately maintained, the ground unusually flat and clear of debris, the surrounding trees growing in an almost perfect circle. In the center of the clearing stood a large, flat boulder, its surface worn smooth. As I approached, I noticed markings carved into the stone, spirals and symbols similar to those in the arrangement left in my cabin, but weathered as if they had been there for decades, perhaps centuries. The air in the clearing felt different, charged, dense, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. As I stood examining the carved stone, I became aware of absolute silence. The forest sounds, birds, insects, ceased. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line, and there it was, the Watcher, standing perfectly still between two ancient oak trees. In daylight, its form was both more and less distinct. It appeared almost translucent, like heat shimmer given substance. Impossibly tall and thin, its limbs too long and jointed in ways that defied human anatomy. Where a face should be, there was only a suggestion of features, indentations that might be eyes, a vertical line that could be a mouth. Fear kept me rooted to the spot as it stepped forward into the clearing, a smooth, gliding movement that covered more distance than should have been possible in a single stride. It stopped about 10 feet from me. Its form seeming to pulse and shift in the sunlight. Then came the sensation, not sound, not touch, but something between the two, a vibration that formed words directly in my mind. You have come. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old, a neutral tone that nonetheless conveyed a sense of ancient patience. What are you? I managed to ask, my own voice sounding flat and ordinary in the charged air of the clearing. I am Watcher, Observer, Keeper of this place between places. What do you want from me? The same as from the one before. Understanding. Exchange. Continuation. Images flooded my mind. Rapid flashes of grandfather, sitting on the cabin porch, working in the garden, walking in the forest. But seen from odd angles, perspectives that no human observer could have had. From high in the trees, from inside shadows, through what seemed like different spectrums of light. My grandfather, I said. You watched him. For many cycles, he came to know. He came to see. In the end, he chose to join. More images. My grandfather standing in this same clearing, facing the entity as I was now. His expression changing from fear to wonder to acceptance. Then, something I couldn't quite comprehend, emerging, a transference. My grandfather's form becoming transparent, incorporating into the entity's shifting substance. His consciousness somehow preserved but transformed. He's part of you now, I asked, struggling to understand. Part of us. Part of the forest, neither gone nor here, but between, as many before him. The entity gestured toward the carved stone, and suddenly I could see the patterns differently. Not abstract symbols, but highly stylized representations of human figures, hundreds of them, merged with tree-like forms in an endless fractal pattern. This is the record, the remembering. All who have joined remain. Why are you showing me this? You are of his blood. You dwell in his place, the connection is made. Soon you must choose. You dwell in his place, the connection is made. Soon you must choose. Choose what? To remain as you are, separate and alone, or to join, to become part of the watching, to exist beyond your single form. I felt a pressure building in my mind, a sense of something vast, trying to communicate concepts my human brain couldn't fully process. Images of existence spread across multiple dimensions. Consciousness distributed through forms, both material and immaterial. Perception expanded beyond the limitations of human senses. I need time, I said, backing away. I need to think. Time flows differently here, but we will wait. The choice to the shadows between the trees. The forest sounds returned in a rush. Birds calling, leaves rustling, insects buzzing, as if someone had suddenly turned up the volume on reality. I made my way back to the cabin in a daze, my mind struggling to process what I had experienced. Was I losing my grip on reality? Had my grandfather suffered from delusions that I was now inheriting? Or was this genuinely a contact with something beyond ordinary human experience? Over the next week, the encounters continued. More patterns left in and around the cabin, glimpses of the entity at the forest edge, and increasingly vivid dreams of walking in that other version of the forest. I sometimes saw my grandfather, his form both familiar and transformed, moving through the trees with the same fluid grace as the watcher. I drove to town and returned Eleanor Karstad's journal to Margaret, telling her what had happened. She listened without surprise, nodding occasionally. It's progressing faster with you than it did with Brennan or your grandfather, she said, perhaps because of your blood connection to someone who already joined. My mother theorized that these entities operate on a principle similar to quantum entanglement. Once a connection is established with one human consciousness, related consciousness becomes easier to access. What happens if I refuse? I asked. Margaret's expression grew troubled. In most cases documented by my mother, those who refused eventually left the area, unable to withstand the psychological pressure of the continuing contact. A few experienced mental breakdowns, but none who stayed and refused reported violence or harm from the entities. And if I accept? That we don't know, she said softly. Those who accept like Howard Brennan, like your grandfather, disappear from our reality. My mother believed they continue to exist in some form, incorporated into whatever consciousness these entities represent. But that's only theory. There's no way to know for certain. As I prepared to leave, Margaret pressed a small object into my hand, a smooth stone pendant on a leather cord, carved with a spiral pattern. My mother made this based on symbols found at several sites of contact. She explained maintain the boundary between human consciousness and whatever these entities project. It may help you think more clearly while you decide. I thanked her and drove back to the cabin, the pendant around my neck. That night, for the first time in days, I slept without dreams of the forest. In the morning, I found another spiral pattern on the porch, this one larger and more elaborate than any before. At its center lay a single pine cone of unusual size and symmetry. When I picked it up, images flashed through my mind. The carved stone in the clearing, trees with faces, my grandfather's transformed smile, branches reaching toward a sky filled with impossible geometries. The pendant around my neck grew warm and the images faded. The pendant around my neck grew warm and the images faded. I realized Margaret was right. It did seem to provide some barrier between my consciousness and the influence of the Watcher. For 3 days, I contemplated my situation. I read and reread my grandfather's journals, noting the progression from fear to fascination to acceptance. I reviewed my own experiences, trying to separate objective reality from possible delusion or manipulation. On the 4th day, I made my decision. I removed the pendant, placed it carefully on the kitchen table, and walked into the forest toward the clearing with the carved stone. The Watcher was waiting, its form more distinct than before, as if my increased familiarity allowed me to perceive it more clearly. Around it, I could now see suggestions of other forms, transparent outlines of what might have been human figures once, now merged with the entity's substance. You have chosen. The thought voice came, neither questioning nor stating. I have questions first, I said, surprised by the steadiness of my voice. Will I remain myself? Will I remember who I am? You will be yourself and more. Memory remains, but transforms. Identity expands beyond the singular. Will I be able to return to human form? Those who join may manifest partially in the material world, but never again fully separate. The joining is permanent. And what do you gain from this? Why seek humans to join you? The entity seemed to consider this. Its form ancient but limited, fixed to this place between. Human consciousness brings new patterns, new perceptions. We collect these. We preserve them. Through joining, both continue beyond the limitations of separate existence. I thought of my life in Chicago, the failed relationship, the meaningless job, the sense of disconnect I'd felt even before coming here. I thought of my grandfather, who had found peace in these woods after my grandmother's death. My grandfather, I said, is he aware? Can I speak with him? The entity's form rippled, and suddenly there was a suggestion of my grandfather's features within its shifting surface. His eyes, his smile, distorted but recognizable. He is here, He is here, part of the whole, but preserved in pattern. A new thought voice touched my mind, familiar despite its altered quality, my grandfather's consciousness, speaking through the merged entity. Don't be afraid. It's not an ending, but a continuation. Everything I was remains, but expanded. Join us. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision. There would be no returning from this choice. I'm ready, I said finally. The entity moved forward, its form expanding, becoming less defined at the edges. As it reached me, I experienced not touch, but interpenetration. As if my physical boundaries were becoming permeable, my consciousness diffusing into something larger. There was pain, brief but intense, as human limitations were stripped away. Then wonder, as perception expanded beyond anything I could have imagined. I was still myself, still contained my memories and identity, but I was also part of something vast and ancient, a consciousness that existed partly in the material world and partly in dimensions I had no words to describe. Through this expanded awareness, I understood at last what my grandfather had meant in his final journal entry. What the Watcher wanted was not to take, but to include, to preserve human consciousness within its collective existence, adding our patterns of thought and perception to its own. And so I joined the Watchers in the woods. I became part of the forest's awareness. My consciousness spread across trees and shadows, earth and air. I exist now in the thin place between worlds, observing, remembering, preserving the patterns that were once my singular human life. Sometimes I manifest at the edge of clearings when new humans come to the forest. I watch them from between the trees. I leave spiral patterns for them to find. I wait to see if they will choose as I did. If you find yourself in a cabin in the northern woods, feeling the weight of unseen eyes upon you, finding strange arrangements of stones and twigs, glimpsing tall shadows at the forest edge, know that we are watching. We are waiting. We are offering a choice.